Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping straight into some really interesting material you sent over. Excerpts describing a pretty intense phone call.
Yeah, that's right. It's this document being called pasted text, and it lays out this, well, very high-stakes conversation between Canada's Prime Minister at the time, Mark Carney, and the U.S. President then, Donald Trump.
And you can sort of picture the contrasting scenes, right? Carney's office in Ottawa, maybe a bit more formal, quieter, perhaps?
Compared to the Oval Office, yeah.
Yeah.
Different vibe entirely. And the advisors were there on both sides. For Carney, it was Dominic LeBlanc, Melanie Joly, his chief aide.
Okay, and for Trump?
Howard Lutnick was there, a national security advisor, and another White House aide. So key people listening in.
So our mission here, our deep dive, is really to unpack this. What were the sticking points? What strategies were they using? And, what does it tell us about the Canada-U.S. relationship? Maybe even Canadian identity?
Exactly. It's quite revealing.
Okay, let's dive in. So the call kicks off, and right away, Trump's congratulating Carney, but it sounds pretty sarcastic.
Yeah, like, congrats on the narrow win, but then immediately claims it was rigged, somehow influenced by his 20% tariffs.
And then the kicker, that 51st state comment, just throws it in there.
Right off the bat. It's a clash of styles, isn't it? Trump trying to sort of undermine Carney's win, claiming his policies influenced the Canadian election.
And that 51st state line, it's not subtle. It's pushing a specific button, right? Playing on that Canadian sensitivity about the U.S.
Definitely feels intentional. Trying to destabilize things, maybe. You can imagine Carney's advisors shifting a bit uncomfortably in Ottawa.
So how does Carney react? The text suggests he pushes back, but how?
Pretty firmly, actually. He just states the facts, says the election was fair, transparent, international observers confirmed it,
Yeah.
and that the tariffs, well, they didn't influence the outcome.
So fact-based, while Trump.
Trump counters with these vague, big, beautiful reports he claims to have, and boasts about his own popularity, saying his win was bigger, everyone loves him.
It's such a contrast. Evidence versus, well, assertion.
Absolutely. And Carney doubles down on the facts. He gives specific numbers for early voting, mail-in votes in Canada.
Right, 7.3 million early votes, 960,000 by mail, all counted fine.
Exactly. A direct challenge to Trump's claims. He's grounding the conversation in actual data, trying to pin Trump down.
Which typically leads Trump to pivot, right?
And he does, straight to the border wall. And fentanyl.
Okay, so what's the demand?
A huge one. $10 billion.
Yeah.
He wants Canada to spend $10 billion on a wall along the northern border.
10 billion, wow. And he links this directly to fentanyl.
Directly. And then threatens a 30% tariff on Canadian cars if they don't comply. He even singles out Ontario's auto exports, mentioning the $2.5 billion value.
That's hitting a major nerve. The auto sector is so integrated.
It's maximum pressure, using the fentanyl issue, which is obviously very serious, to push his border agenda and his trade agenda. It's aggressive.
Carney's response, does he just reject it?
It's interesting. He's firm, yes, but he also appeals to history, to the relationship. He talks about the world's longest undefended frontier. The symbolism of that.
Implying a wall is just absurd, almost.
Pretty much. And then he highlights what Canada is already doing, spending $1.3 billion on border security drones, AI surveillance, working with U.S. Border Patrol.
So framing it as cooperation, not negligence, trying to counter the idea that Canada isn't serious about security.
Exactly. Contrasting cooperation with Trump's more confrontational demands.
How does Trump take that?
Dismisses it completely, calls Canada a pushover, and brings up the 51st state thing again.
So he's not buying the nuance, just sticking to his guns.
Seems like it. Reinforcing his view of Canada as sort of subordinate, which Carney seems really determined to fight back against.
And how does he fight back?
Stands his ground, rejects the wall, rejects the tariffs, rejects what he calls bullying, and then he turns the tables a bit. He points out that the auto tariffs wouldn't just hurt Canada, they'd hurt American consumers, cost American jobs. In Detroit, Chicago, he mentioned the 100,000 jobs in Ontario's auto sector, implying a ripple effect.
Smart. Highlighting the shared economic pain, making it not just a Canada problem, but a U.S. problem, too.
Exactly. Shifting from defense to pointing out the potential blowback for the U.S. itself.
Okay, so where does the conversation go from there?
It moves to another flashpoint. Tech taxes. Specifically taxes Canada was levying on big U.S. tech companies in Vancouver, like Amazon, Microsoft, Google.
And Trump wants these cut.
Demands it. He even links it to the USMCA, the trade deal. Suggests Canada's violating the spirit of it or something. And he name drops Jeff Bezos and Satya Nadella.
Trying to use personal connections, maybe? Or just show he's talking to these CEOs?
Probably a bit of both. It's a very direct attempt to interfere in Canadian tax policy, using the trade deal as leverage.
How does Carney handle that pressure?
Calmly, it seems. Precise. He defends the taxes as being balanced under the USMCA. He points out Canada has its own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, beer, bourbon, orange juice.
So reminding Trump it's a two-way street, tit for tat.
Right. And emphasizes the taxes are about protecting Canadian workers, supporting that $2 billion tech hub in Vancouver, the 50,000 jobs there.
So defending Canada's right to set its own policy.
Absolutely. He's showing he knows the trade deal inside out and isn't going to be pushed around on domestic policy.
Trump's reaction, I'm guessing not pleased.
Definitely not. The text says he escalates, accuses Canada of stabbing North America in the back.
Yeah.
Even calls Canada a European socialist.
Wow, okay, the rhetoric's really heating up there.
Yeah, classic Trump tactic, perhaps, using inflammatory language when he doesn't get his way, trying to paint Canada's position negatively.
But Carney, does he back down?
Not at all. Stands firm. Says Canada doesn't kneel to bullies, Canadian workers come first, and then he drops something significant.
Oh, what's that?
A preliminary trade deal with the European Union.
Really? While on the call with Trump?
Seems so. He mentions it's projected to boost Canadian exports by 20%, about $18 billion in new trade, wheat, machinery, you name it. And that talks are ongoing with Japan, too, potentially another $4 billion.
That's quite a countermove. Talk about leverage.
It's huge, strategically.
Yeah.
It shows Canada isn't just dependent on the U.S. market. It has other major options. It fundamentally changes the power dynamic of the call, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That EU deal alone, $18 billion, that's serious diversification.
Yeah, you can almost feel the air change. Carney's team must be feeling pretty good. Trump's team, maybe less so.
You'd think so.
Yeah.
It directly undermines Trump's whole leverage point, the idea that Canada needs the U.S. above all else. Shows Canada's playing a global game.
So does Trump acknowledge that or just move on?
The conversation seems to swing back to fentanyl again, and Trump's tone gets even sharper.
How so?
He apparently outright accuses Canada of pumping fentanyl into the U.S. He even cites a number 650 kilos seized in 2024.
And links this to another threat.
Yes. A 25% tariff on Canadian crops. Again, specifically mentioning Saskatchewan wheat exports, that $1.8 billion figure, hitting the agricultural sector hard.
So doubling down on economic threats, trying to link Canada unfairly to the fentanyl crisis.
Exactly. A very pointed threat at a key part of the Canadian economy, potentially causing real political waves in Canada.
Carney's response: more data.
More data. And this time, it's U.S. data he uses. He states that 97% of fentanyl seized in the U.S. comes via Mexico, citing the DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration.
Using Trump's own government's data against the argument. That's bold.
Very effective.
Yeah.
It directly contradicts Trump's accusation and points the finger where U.S. authorities say the problem originates. He also reminds Trump about Canada's investment in the Joint Task Force, the $1.3 billion for border security overall.
Does it work? Does Trump back off the claim?
Apparently not. The text suggests he refuses to shift blame, just keeps hammering on the threat to Saskatchewan farmers, the $10 billion grain industry, even mentions prairie families.
Sticking to the narrative, regardless of the facts presented, and using that emotional, personalized threat.
Seems to be the pattern. He's not letting facts get in the way of the pressure tactic.
And Carney then brings up the impact on Americans.
It does. He points out, look, these tariffs on Canadian food, they're just going to make groceries more expensive for Americans.
All right, hitting the U.S. consumer. Another attempt to show the downside for the U.S. itself.
Exactly. Highlighting that interconnectedness again. These actions have consequences on both sides of the border.
Okay, what's next? Military spending.
Yep. Pivots to military demands. Trump wants Canada to buy more F-35 jets. He links it to NATO burden sharing, that recurring theme.
And throws in the threat to pull the U.S. out of NATO.
That threat is mentioned, yes. Classic pressure tactic on NATO allies to spend more.
How does Carney field this one?
Again, calmly. He just highlights Canada's existing commitment, 88 F-35s already ordered, a $19 billion deal, plus Canada's overall $10 billion defense budget, mentioning things like Arctic patrols.
So basically saying, we are contributing significantly, countering the narrative that Canada isn't pulling its weight.
Pretty much. Reassuring, but also pushing back against the premise of the demand.
And then Carney makes another big strategic play. Something about oil.
A really significant one. He mentions that Canada has been actively diversifying its oil exports, shipping more to the EU and Japan.
Why is that significant in this context?
Because the U.S. relies heavily on Canadian oil. About 60% of U.S. crude imports come from Canada. That's worth something like $100 billion a year. By showing Canada's finding other buyers, Carney is subtly reducing U.S. leverage.
So reminding Trump that the energy relationship is vital for the U.S. too, and that Canada has other customers. He mentions new Asian contracts.
$22 billion in new contracts with Asia, yes. It's a powerful point.
hmm
Canada's not just a supplier, it's a major global energy player with options.
Trump's reaction to that.
Dismissive, apparently. Something like Texas. We don't need your sludge.
But his team.
The notes say they looked uneasy because they know the reality. U.S. refineries, especially in the Midwest and down to the Gulf Coast, really depend on that Canadian crude, maybe 20% of their supply.
So a disconnect between the political rhetoric and the economic facts on the ground.
A big one. The advisors likely get the potential impact much more clearly than Trump lets on.
This call is just jumping all over the place. What's next? Boycotts.
Yeah, kind of a strange turn, but it fits the tense mood. Trump accuses Canadians of boycotting U.S. stuff, beer, bourbon, even Disney World, Vegas, Miami. Says visits are down 12%.
And claims Americans are boycotting Canada back.
That's the claim. Less interest in Canadian lumber, oil, and tourism spots like Banff and Vancouver, down 18% in bookings.
So trying to show mutual economic pain from the bad feeling.
Exactly. Highlighting that the political tension is having real-world effects on both sides.
Carney's response. Does he deny the boycotts?
He doesn't deny them, but he frames them differently. He directly links any Canadian boycott to Trump's tariffs, and that 51st state comment basically says, you started it.
A consequence of U.S. actions, not just random Canadian animosity.
Right, and then he actually highlights a Canada First campaign, claiming it's boosted local buying by 18%, saved maybe $6 billion in trade, turns it into a positive story for Canada.
And he brings up oil and lumber again.
Yeah, reminds Trump how much the U.S. relies on Canada for those 60% of imported oil, 30% of lumber. Basically arguing a U.S. boycott hurts U.S. industries just as much, if not more.
Because they need those supplies. It's self-inflicted pain.
That's the point he's making. Protectionism cuts both ways.
Trump then threatens a specific tax on Canadian tourists.
Yes, a tax on Canadians visiting the U.S. But Carney seems unfazed.
How does he counter that?
Pretty confidently. Suggests Canadians will just travel within Canada instead.
Yeah.
Talks up Lake Louise, Banff, PEI. Mentions Canada's own $20 billion tourism industry is doing just fine.
Basically saying, go ahead, it won't hurt us much, might even help our domestic tourism, dismissing the threat.
Exactly. Emphasizing Canadian resilience and options again.
Okay, so it feels like Carney's gaining the upper hand here.
The momentum definitely seems to shift. Carney starts summarizing Canada's position. The match tariffs are in place. The big new EU trade deal is happening. The Japan deal is progressing.
And hammers home the sovereignty point.
Absolutely. Repeats clearly. Canada is not the 51st state. A firm assertion of independence.
And Trump, what's his final move?
It sounds almost desperate, according to the text. He apparently makes one last pitch for Canada to just become the 51st state.
Seriously, after all...
And offers Carney a golf trip to Mar-a-Lago as, like, a sweetener.
Wow. Wow, that feels completely out of touch with everything Carney just said.
A total disconnect, yeah?
Carney's response. I assume he didn't pack his clubs.
No. The text says he's completely unflinching, politely mentions there are great golf courses in Ontario, too, and insists any serious discussion, any deal would have to be signed in Ottawa. He even invites Trump to visit and learn about Canadian unity.
Turning it right back around, setting the terms on Canadian soil, reasserting agency right to the end.
A very firm, very Canadian response, perhaps. Polite but resolute.
And how does the call end?
Abruptly, Trump slams the phone down. His team is described as looking deflated.
And in Ottawa.
Quiet pride, a sense of victory, of having stood their ground successfully. That contrast really says it all, doesn't it?
It really does. So, after this call, Carney addresses the nation.
Yes, gives a national address, focuses on unity, draws parallels to tough times in the past like World War II, the 2008 financial crisis, really emphasizing Canadian strength, sovereignty, resilience.
Trying to build on that moment, frame it for the country.
Exactly. Capitalizing on the outcome, boosting national pride, reinforcing that message of resolve.
And the media reaction. Sounds like it was positive.
Oh, overwhelmingly so, according to the notes. CBC called it a masterclass of Canadian diplomacy. The Globe and Mail mentioned rekindled national pride. Reuters said Canada solidified its global standing. Even the BBC noted Canada's quiet strength.
So it resonated both at home and internationally. Seen as a win for Canada and for Carney's approach.
Definitely seems that way. The coverage really amplified that narrative of resilience.
So, wrapping this deep dive up, what's the big takeaway for you when you look at this whole exchange?
For me, it really boils down to that theme of Canadian unity and maybe strategic resilience when pushed. It's not just about enduring pressure, is it?
No, it seems more active than that.
Right. It's about actively defending interests, using diplomacy, using facts, diversifying options.
Yeah.
Like with those trade deals, it connects to that history you mentioned, Vimy Ridge, other crises. Canada finds a way to not just survive, but sort of thrive on its own terms.
So, strength in unity, sovereignty, and that commitment to a distinct Canadian path.
That's what really comes through these excerpts, I think.
A powerful story, no doubt. It really leaves you thinking, and maybe this is the final thought for you, our listeners, building on this idea of resilience. What other moments in Canadian history really show this kind of national unity and smart maneuvering against, well, significant external pressures? And maybe think about how those lessons, the ones from this call and those other moments, how they might apply to the challenges Canada faces on the world stage today.